Alright, so it's streaming now, right? Okay, cool. Alright, cool. Alright, thank you. Can you hear anything that's going on right now?
We're missing dinner.
I'm leaving. Yep.
I saw you walking back there.
Oh yeah, I have to get changed. I dinner at 7, so I have to get changed in this. But no, in the end, I'm not actually going to see any of this dinner. But no, I'm going to leave. I've got dinner at 6:30, I'm going to leave at 7 to get there on time. These friends from out of town.
So you just come in.
I thought I'd see the first half an hour.
Oh, right.
But now it's late. If it started on time, the plan would be perfect. You
Can't trust other people.
can't trust the beta.
Can't trust anyone.
It's quite a negative outlook on life there.
Which hole did you that's it. Are
Yeah, it's literally around the corner.
How'd you like it?
It's real. I like it. Yeah, it's a good mix. Your sheet, where is it? It's under my arm. Yeah, it's weird.
That could be a really misconstrued statement. Like, I was just like something weird.
Yeah, are you going to stay in the seat?
Yeah.
You're
You said you have to sit here for
Yeah, I do. But, you know, annoying you sometimes.
You're not annoying. I don't have to.
sit rest.
What you've done. Vicious cycle. Just kidding.
Yes,
Vicious circle happens in the title, but it takes don't give any. Just like you guys. Funny. Good one. It's a different kind. It's a different kind of comedy. It's just kind of you find funny. People can be kind of dry. No, I find some comedy funny. Some is a little dry. A lot of like. Azizi, I'm sorry. Like, I'm gonna send you some links, like some really funny bits, and then you can talk with them. I had to use it. This is really lively.
Sit up and go to
I can't hear when the sound of the scintillating orchestra start. I found a way to watch American television on my computer today. I downloaded a proxy. I'm really happy though. I just wanted to express my joy. You know whiskey, that's happy. I don't think there's anything happier than whiskey. There's $25,000 worth of bourbon stolen from a brewery in Kentucky last year. 25K. Happy Van Winkle and hardcore stuff. Do you get to take warm showers? Is there a You push up with the girl? In a shower. My mom's old. I feel like I never get to take hot water shower.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second exhibition debate of the year on animal research. We're having this exhibition debate in light of National Biology Week, and we're also supporting this organization called the International Debate Education Association. So thank you all for coming here on a Thursday evening. The motion that will be debated on today is this House would ban all forms of animal research. And I'll be handing over to our chairperson for tonight, Samantha, to introduce you to the speakers.
Thank you everyone for coming. So I'll be introducing the speakers as they come up. So to open the case on the motion that stands before us today, we have Jamil Mustafa from Opening Government. Jamil is currently our non-portfolio member, and he is also our finalist of the Knowledge Cup from last year.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start the case from Opening Government by proposing a hypothetical scenario to you. I'd like you to imagine that on Earth, a species came to exist with greater cognitive functions and collective action capabilities than humanity. Basically, that was more intelligent than we were. I'd like them to hypothesize that this species then went on to, exploit us in similar ways we do to the animals currently in terms of animal research and other factors like that. I'd like to ask, what would our response to that be? We also like the proposition to think, A, we wouldn't like it and would dislike it a lot. Second of all, we think, we would mount some sort of active resistance to this. And we think there's some historical precedent for this, given the Nuremberg trials and stuff that related to Nazi war crimes and doctors who experimented on humans and how abhorrent we thought that was. We say in the current status quo, because animals do not have the same level of cognitive ability, collective action abilities that we do, in order to have a voice and express the things about in the current animal research environment that exists in Western countries and generally in the world. This issue is generally treated as something that's not as important as it should be, given there's no voice, there is nobody really lobbying, Parliament or interest groups as such that have electoral representation. Animals don't have votes, so we think this moral issue is generally just being discarded from society. This is a terribly, terribly bad thing. In my speech, I'm going to offer you two key arguments as to why we think this is a morally bad thing. First of all, I'm going to unpick the justifications philosophically and morally for for animal research. The second one, I'm going to talk about more structural factors relating to the industry. My partner Kawaj is going to talk more about the broader implications of this, dealing with the commercialization of life as an entity, and also of more general policy implications. I first want to outline our position on this debate in terms of definition of emotion. We define animal research forms as any technique of cosmetic, pharmaceutical, or medical experimentation that involves applying things to actually live animals and growing ears on them as was done. We think this is a bad thing. What we do allow for, however, is post-mortem analysis of animal bodies that died of natural causes, given the fact animals fortunately don't really believe in things like religion and stuff like that, so don't really care about bodily integrity to the same extent. So we say that that's valid. Okay. What we also say on side proposition is, we really do believe in, that animals are equal to us in the sense that we are, advocating vegetarianism and stuff like that, and so very consistent with our case. So, moving on to the first of our arguments. We'll first of all deal with the idea of, why do we think this is morally unjust? 3 reasons. First of all, we believe that pain is, the criterion of, moral inclusion in discourse. Second of all, we believe that most justifications for animal research are based on an implicit assumption of human superiority that we don't think is substantiated generally in society, and that it just isn't true in a tangible sense. Thirdly, we believe that the benefits to animals from such reasons, like veterinary medicine, is disproportionate to their contribution, and the humans benefit disproportionately from this. Before I start, yeah.
If we're equal to animals, should, say, a chimpanzee living in Britain be covered by the NHS?
Well, John, I think this is a bit of a superficial critique of the more general moral issue at hand here, which is how do we go about deciding in our treatment of things regardless of the fact of the level of intelligence or what they are. I think this is more broadly about how our scope for moral activity and why it relates to animals in ways that we think isn't currently being accounted for, as I'll explain in my standard speech now. Okay, so firstly, why do we think that pain is the inclusion of of moral treatment? Well, first of all, pain's not really nice. A general common feature between humans and animals is we generally go towards pleasure and away from pain. And this is a bad thing. Yeah. No, thank you. And why do we think that animal research causes this pain? Well, we first of all think it shortens the life expectancy of generally animals. Actual evidence pain research in animals shows that this actually happens. This is a definite harm, given the fact that we believe that the standard or the basis of what we should be considering as moral agents should be the fact that they can feel pain. They should be included in decision making, regardless of the fact their cognitive abilities and ability to choose what they do is not necessarily the same as it is for us. If we want that as our basis, we should give more votes to people who are smarter than other people, or treat people in moral categories, which we think is a bad idea. And I know John's loving it, but I think we all agree it's a terrible thing in the sense of it's prioritising people on the basis of arbitrary characteristics of education rather than whether they can feel pleasure or pain, which is fundamentally what defines them. Second of all, why do we think there's an implicit assumption of human superiority in this? Because generally, animal research is justified on the basis that human benefits from it cannot be gained in any other way. I'll deal with the latter of these points, dealing with structural issues in the industry. But first, we're why does this discourse of human superiority exist? Well, as I say, first of all, animals don't have a voice and can't really argue their case. But second of all, there are 2 other strains to this. First of all, is the idea that a lot of this is based on Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of the whole dominion argument. It's a part and parcel of religious lasting effect in our society is the fact that we still believe animals are fundamentally lower things. And the reason why we don't really deal with this is because steak tastes really good. So we don't really put as much salience on this in conjunction with other factors such as they can't really express their grievances themselves accurately. And that means that this narrative has been perpetuated. We also think that the human superiority argument, as we say, is fundamentally based on this first point, the assumption that rationality and cognitive abilities is the barrier for moral treatment, which I heard us argue in our case earlier. We believe this just isn't true. And so any justification based on utilitarian benefits to the human race, excluding animals, we think is just fundamentally incorrect. Moving on to the third of these points, is the idea that animals are the net contributors to the net recipients. Okay, we're not denying the existence of animal research for animals. What we do say at the Higher is that animals actually suffer a lot more under the status quo from this system than they would otherwise. Why is this? Well, 3 reasons we think of this. First of all, in current animal research fields, generally vet med isn't that generally that well taught. There's 10 unis that do it in the UK. Second of all, we believe that funding towards this this sector of research is substantially less compared to the human side. And why is this? Well, for starters, it's kind of easy to get donors to contribute towards research on animals for human benefit. Rather than animal learning, because animals don't have the same coherent lobbying, don't have the same marketability to invest in this. So we think fundamentally, animals are getting the net contributors and we're the net recipients, and that's a bad thing, given the amount of pain and the other harms I've already outlined that are run correlated to this. We think it's a very terrible thing. We're going to my last point really quickly before we're out of time. Is okay, like, cyber being the only way to, like, solve these issues in terms of, like, you know, we can only really get medical breakthroughs through the use of animal research. We fundamentally disagree. What we say is that the structural incentives within the current industry are geared towards cost efficiency. And because it's more cost efficient to test on animals, companies tend to do that because, you know, GlaxoSmithKline, etc., want to, you know, keep profits going. This what that means is they tend to go for animal research rather than developing new forms of more costly experimentation. So what I'll tell you today. I'll tell you firstly why it's morally abhorrent, and second of all, why structural incentives within the industry mean that, you know, this system will be perpetuated without action. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank Jamil for his speech. I would now like to invite the leader of the opposition, Samuel Johnson, to take the floor. Samuel was a previous external liaisons officer, and he's currently a trainee at Freshfields.
Insulin for diabetes, HIV/AIDS drugs, Alzheimer's drugs, cancer drugs, malaria drugs, the list could go on forever. Every day, millions and millions of people around the world rely on medical drugs being tested as extensively as possible in order for them to live their lives and to live a satisfactory standard of life. We do not say that the medical testing that goes with this is nice. We do not say it's pleasant. We agree with side proposition that sometimes it can be pretty grim. However, we do say on side opposition that sometimes it's necessary. We do not have to present to you on side opposition today that, for example, cosmetic testing is acceptable. We don't even have to present to you of why all medical testing is acceptable. We've just got to say on side opposition that in some circumstances, if there's a drug that could massively change the lives of millions and millions of people around the world, that animal testing is justified in this circumstance. What are we going to do to prove this today? First of all, I'm going to do 2 points of rebuttal to Jim's case. No, thank you. Then I'm going to do 2 points of substantive. Why it's philosophically and principally better for animals to suffer rather than humans, and also why it's practically better for animals to suffer rather than humans. But first of all, just 2 quick points of rebuttal, and the rest will be interwoven. Jamil has essentially said that animals have been we've taken a lot from animals, and they've given and we've given absolutely nothing else back to them. He's argued that they feel extreme pain, and their pain is essentially equatable to our pain. We are on side opposition that say that's not quite true. The unique thing about a human is that they can conceptualize their being. They can recognize that death is coming, they can look into the future and use foresight. One of the worst pains one can have is the fear of the future. And therefore, despite the animals feeling the physical pain, they don't necessarily have the same mental pain as the humans, and therefore, on that, his point simply doesn't stand. The other case he made was, it's wrong that we have this implicit assumption of human superiority. On side opposition, we don't say this is an implicit assumption. We say this is natural fact. Ultimately, what's happened throughout human, world history is the strongest beings have evolved, so they assert their dominion over others. We are above animals in that ranking purely naturally because we have physical strength and mental strength above their own, and that's why we assert their dominion. We don't necessarily say this is always right. However, this is just the status quo, and therefore it's not wrong to assert our superiority. No, thank you. So moving on to my first point of substantive today. Why is it principally better for animals to suffer than humans? Ultimately, animals, on some opposition, we accept that humans and animals both have rights. We accept that humans and animals could potentially lead to the same solutions in the long run. And we accept for humans and animals, the medical testing to get to the end goal will be brutal in times, but it is necessary in the long run. So why is it better for animals rather than humans to suffer? First of all, we say that humans in general have a much greater mental capacity and indeed live much longer lives than humans. On a very simplistic economic basis, therefore, they can gain greater utility from their longer lives, they can enjoy a longer life, and generally they enjoy a better standard of life because they've got the mental capacity to appreciate all the benefits of the world around them. That's the simplistic case. But when you tie that with what I've already said to you about the idea of pain and the cost that people go through to provide this testing, I'll take it in a minute, Jamil, that's ultimately what clinches it. Animals cannot conceptualize themselves as a being, and they can't conceptualize what's happening, meaning in the future, meaning that ultimately, when their testing is taking place, the animals will inevitably suffer far more than the humans, and therefore, if we're just doing a cost-benefit analysis, it is ultimately the humans that should not have to take the pain here. Of course, they both have rights, but there are times when we just make a utilitarian calculus in our society that some people's rights have to be exchanged for the benefit of the mass majority. Think of things like humanitarian war. Think of things in terms of in other forms of testing. We make this calculation all the time, and because the cost to humans is much greater than the cost to animals, it's the animals that philosophically should take the pain. Yes, or no?
Going back to your utility point, you explained to us two things. First of all, what is the nature and commonality between the utility of animals and humans that makes you able to make the comparison you've just made to justify that animals should not be tested?
Okay. We say ultimately it's very simple. It's the mental capacity to understand the world around them and also the benefit to live a longer life. Because they live a higher quality of life, because they can understand more of it, and because they have a greater length of it in the long term. And that's why we say alongside the point of pain, they've got to be taken together. It's principally better for the animals to suffer. Why is it practically better for the animals to suffer then? What is normally tested in these animal testing scenarios? Firstly, massive organ failure and system failure. Then it's the major issues like cancer, diabetes, critical illnesses that could be an immediate result of these drugs. But then it came the 1960s, and they added one more thing to that list. What happened in the 1960s? In the 1960s, there was the thalidomide scandal. Essentially what happened here was because drugs companies didn't test their medical drugs on a generational level, so they didn't look into what happened later down the line, it essentially meant that the offspring of the people who took those drugs were extremely disabled and lived a much worse standard of life. Uniquely, animal testing can offer these generational tests that human testing can't, because ultimately, and this is what we do now with animal testing, when we test new drugs, animals can reproduce very quickly. For example, rats, they can reproduce in, for example, 6 months, and therefore, in the lifetime of the people who are suffering from these illnesses, they can test these new drugs, they can bring them in, because they can see the direct results of the drugs on these animals, and therefore they can get a greater conception, a wider conception of the drug, and it becomes much safer to use. After the thalidomide scandal, it's actually then legal to use because they've checked what happens later down the line. Therefore, that's a practical benefit that opposition simply can't give us of why humans can do that, because ultimately they can't wait 30 years for to check if it passes on to the children. And that's why on a practical benefit, even if you don't buy the philosophical stuff, it's a necessity that it's humans that must do this. So for those two reasons, because it's principally better that the animals suffer rather than the humans, and that it's practically more sensible that the animals suffer than the humans, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
The next time for a speech, I would now like to invite Akbar to continue the case for government. Akbar is currently the treasurer of the society. He was a previous Pakistani World School speaker and was also a Novice Cup finalist.
Stanley comes up over here and tells us about how millions and millions of people benefit from this animal research. But well, do you know that 4 million animals every year in the UK are researched on? They have a very value-laden idea over here that somehow animals are less important in society, or somehow animals have a lesser form of utility as compared to human beings. And throughout my case, I'm going to be showing to you how these distinctions are extremely arbitrary and how we're encouraging something bad if we follow their model. So before I move on to my positive case, which is basically going to be about commercialization of life and the message that it sends to the common man in society, I have certain questions to raise and certain rebuttals to make. My first question is that even if animal research is allowed, is it accurate all the time? They don't understand the fact that animals and human beings are different kinds of creatures, and as a result of that, they have different metabolisms and different biological procedures. As a result of which, you are risking the animal's life, but you're not even sure that the kind of endpoint that you're going to achieve from that is going to be the right endpoint. But more importantly, my second question is it the only means? What the opposition says is that this is the only means through which we can basically have some kind of research, through which we can basically find a way to deal with diabetes, to produce insulin. But we basically believe that this is not the only way. This is the most cost-effective way from them. So what's happening over here is that this world is not the same world that it was in the 1960s. We have a lot of scientific advancements, and as a result of those advancements, what we've seen in society is that research processes without these animals, the effect of certain chemicals on human beings, can be known without this research on animals. But what they do is that they just check it on an animal because it is more cost-effective for them. We believe that this is completely morally wrong, and that is the reason we're completely against it. My third question is, what makes you think that animals don't have a sense of consciousness? Now, Sammy comes up over here and says that animals have no sense of consciousness. But we believe animals do have a sense of consciousness. Animals will try protecting themselves from other predators in society. Animals will procreate in society. Animals will try to take care of their children and protect them from the other dangerous factors that exist in society. And for that reason, we basically believe that animals have a sense of consciousness. Now, what's going on over here is that Sammy has his own value-laden idea of what consciousness actually means. We believe that this is completely wrong because animals have completely different lives around them. And we don't believe that the fact that they have a different form of consciousness should be the basis of why we should research them. We do not see how that legitimizes researching on a certain thing which has a similar form of life that we do. Let's move on to my fourth question from Team Opposition. And this question basically is about how utility can it even be the basis of an argument. Now let's talk about the basic fact of utility. I'm a person, I enjoy killing other people. That is my form of utility. That gives me a lot of fun. I believe that form of utility, though it may be really important to me, but it is not legitimized in some way. And in a similar manner, just because we may just get some utility out of testing certain drugs on animals, we do not believe that it suddenly legitimizes it at all. And therefore we believe that it, at the end, is morally wrong. And morals for us are more important than utility over here, and that is because we value human life. This brings me directly to my case, but before that, Sam.
Just take note that he's completely ignored my second point. He couldn't respond to why animals had the unique benefit of doing multi-generational testing and humans.
We believe that that is something that you just assume. We believe that society and science has transformed to a next level. Even if the animals have that capacity, we believe science now has greater capacity to not even do that. We believe that science can do that without animal research in the first place. And that is where we disagree with them. Moving on to my own positive case, let's talk about how commercialization of life through animal research is something wrong. Jameel came up to you and he talked to you about how morals prevent us from doing something like this. And we believe that it's extremely wrong for commercial entities in society to take any steps which are going to have such a negative impact on our society. We believe that there is a certain kind of message that these corporations send. And that message basically is that these are hegemons which are okay with playing with life. We believe that the message that they're sending is that we are going to play with life, and our means to do that is going to be through animal research, and this is for the maximum profit that we want to make. What Team Opposition forgets in this debate is that these pharmaceutical companies and these cosmetic companies don't just have one aim of making sure that there's some kind of scientific development. A greater aim for these companies itself is making profit. And in the need of making that profit, we believe that they are devaluing human life. And do we want such companies to send such a message in society? No. Why is it even worse that these companies are allowed to send that message? We believe that these companies today, these pharmaceutical companies, have a lot of political bargaining power. They are interconnected in the basis of society as well, and they have a great influence on the society itself. And we believe that it's extremely wrong to allow these companies to basically exploit these animals in that way and send a message to the society that it's okay for us to exploit life, to exploit something which is so close to humankind just for the sake of making profit. And we believe that that is something which is completely wrong. This brings me to the last point of my speech, which is basically the kind of message that it sends to society. We basically believe that in our society, we have a certain conception, a perception that says that life needs to be valued. What they're basically doing is that they're inculcating a different concept in the mind of normal people. This concept basically says that you are allowed to draw arbitrary distinctions, just the way you draw a distinction between animals and human beings within human beings as well. So for example, if someone belongs to a lower class, or if someone is brown like me, they're naturally inferior to who you are. And on the basis of that arbitrary distinction that you make in society, you can exploit them, you can test them for certain things. So just because I have a brown gene in me, someone white who finds himself superior can come and start testing me on a certain thing. We believe that this is in itself something which is completely against the morality that we are trying to prove over here. So at the end of the day, what this does is that it sends a very bad message to society. So we've raised certain questions today through the course of our speeches today. And these questions we expect to be answered by Ginny now. And we've also raised two arguments, one about the commercialization of life and the other about the message it sends to society. So we expect a response on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin, for his passionate speech, and now I invite June to come up and finish the case for opening opposition. June is currently our communications officer, and she's also our Novice Cup champion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first draw your attention on how debate on animal testing is often undeniably emotive, and a lot of people like to play with the ideas that are often absolute. And this is a way the proposition has been characterizing animal testing. People easily illustrate like an image of a bunch of mad scientists torturing a kitten, for example, and people tend to see the animal research as a kind of like torturing process which has no utility to it. However, on our side of opposition, we believe that we support animal testing because it has greater utility to human progress. So we propose an alternative model where we say we should not ban animal testing, but we should keep it to the highest standard of regulation. So before I go into the rebuttals, I just outline my some substantive points. That the crux of the argument in this debate is its necessity. Proposition and opposition both kind of agree on the same level that we don't exactly endorse a pain at any level. However, because animal testing is so necessary for our human beings, we have to come to a point where we make no thanks. Have to make some kind of a utilitarian calculus for the benefit of human beings. However, before that, I'd like to offer some rebuttals about the points raised by our work. So firstly, proposition actually has been criticizing on how our whole case is based on a value-laden conception of human life and human superiority over animals. However, I'd like to just draw your attention to how, and in many of the decisions that we make in our life, value-laden choices and conceptualizing a particular value is actually inevitable. And if we consider how all species, not just humans, but animals, are insensitive to the extent of their own survival and benefits. So therefore, on the opposition, making our case from the perspective of humans is completely acceptable. And secondly, our court has been pointing out that there is no point in sacrificing the animal lives when a single research wouldn't necessarily even lead to a benefit outcome for humans, and those lives is being wasted. However, I would like to say that a single research may not necessarily lead to a solution to cancer or any other diseases that we are concerned about. However, all these processes of research lead path to the kind of life-changing achievements that we have been seeing by far. And also, no thanks. But also, proposition has been characterizing the whole process of animal testing and animal research in terms of monetary benefits, with corporations abusing our power over animals for monetary benefits. However, we believe that this is a very limited view of animal research. The whole fundamental purpose of animal research is not to raise money, but for the good of the humanity and for the human progress by benefits of human progress through medical means. So can you deny the benefit? Can you deny the benefits of antibiotics, insulin, statins, various examples raised by Sally? No. So our opposition case is based on the absolute utility and necessity of animal testing. And now I'd like to Now I'd like to move on to my main substantive on imagining the world where animal testing will be banned. So we can imagine approximately two consequences flowing from animal testing being banned instead of being regulated. Yes.
Okay. clearly you accept balance, because clearly you're willing to give up numerous medical benefits by restricting this to only the most necessary cases, which seems to concede that there should be a balance there. But where would you draw the line? If animal testing is harmful, what is important enough and what isn't, and how would you do this?
Well, that isn't it. Again, I think the proposition line is again trying to bring out the idea that right to life is somehow absolute, and drawing the line is always difficult, and it is always never possible for us to actually define the exact line. However, that will depend on the views of the people at the time and what most people seem to agree. And I'd like to also point out again that we need to stress how the kind of rights and the kind of values of life drawn up by the proposition are never absolute, and we must accept that we come to situations we inevitably face where we have to make a choice based on the kind of calculus, and the choice which appears to have a utilitarian calculus for our own species, and even if a choice that appears to have the strongest moral imperatives, for example, may not be the right choice for the majority and or for the future. No thanks. Just jumping back to my substantive again, so we're suggesting the alternative model of a stronger regulation. Actually, according to our status quo, the UK and many other countries across the world has a very high standard of ethical conduct implemented in place. And we must remember that the purpose of the scientists and the researchers who engage in animal testing, their purpose is to test the drugs for the further benefit of the human medical research. They do not purport to maximize animal pain, and they try all they can in all their methodology to make sure that the pain is minimized. And this is particularly due to the fact a lot of the alternative models not using animals, such as using human stem cells, aren't exactly appropriate for the kind of research that we need to engage in, because we often need to see how the use of drugs have an impact on the entire body rather than certain parts of the organism. So anyway, jumping onto my substantive again, we believe that in the absence of, in the case of banning such practices, we will have to experience a situation where we lack appropriate regulation. So, as we have established the clear necessity of animal testing, scientists wouldn't just necessarily turn to other kinds of testing methods. They would. It is highly likely that this practice is actually going to go on the ground. The proposition seems to think that banning is synonymous to the end of animal suffering, but this is not the case. It's more likely that scientists will engage in the practice of animal testing underground, whereas without the kind of the government regulation that to minimize the harms on the animals. And also, we believe that the higher regulation is necessary because banning this practice will actually lead to greater harm for both animals and humans. For example, even if scientists decided not to engage in animal testing, respecting all the arguments from the proposition, they will turn to what seemed to be the best alternative, abusing the people who will willingly subject themselves to human testing. Science projects are normally sponsored by huge pharmaceutical corporations, and we believe that they can easily attract human testers for high rewards. And we believe that, as Akbar has drawn the points, it is not only going to commercialize animal life, but also, and most importantly, commercialize human life. As Sami already established, the philosophical ground why it is comparably better for the comparably more justified to animal sufferings, we believe that banning will actually lead to the consequence of human beings who are the victims of income inequality and desperate situations to be forced into a situation where they have to degrade themselves. So for all these reasons, I would like to urge you to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a speech, and now to start the closing half of the debate, we invite Dan Vernon. Dan Vernon has represented LSE at Euros, Worlds, and is an international mace finalist.
You know, the previous speaker asked a question. She listed a series of diseases, cancer, I think malaria, HIV, and said who would hold it against people and deny people the best chances of getting cured. Well, as I point out POI, clearly she's willing to do so, because not only are they coming out here not in favor of animal testing as good, but completely against it, except in very, very extreme cases, which I assume means that they want to regulate it to the most minimal number of cases necessary, or they're simply going to make themselves feel better pretending to do so and not making a change in the status quo. We think this is actually goes a long way to actually undermine the partners' points, who had come up here and made what we thought was an interesting case for why animal testing can be beneficial in some cases. What we want to argue here, however, is that that's neither here nor there, because we don't think their universe exists. We don't think it exists in a sense that you can simply regulate these things out of existence, first without regulating the benefits they bring up, in which case you might as well get rid of the harm altogether instead of allowing it to exist, especially once you've expressed condemnation but still doing it. It's probably worse to do something that you admit is hideously immoral and wrong than something that at least you can make a case for that is good. But we think it's furthermore a very, very dangerous line because we don't think it in practice will actually work, in the sense that we don't think that you can ever narrow it down to that line. We don't think you can narrow it down to cosmetic testing because we think the entire problem we have with animal testing is not animal testing itself in the individual animals, though we do weed for the sheep who have to wear very, very poorly matched lipstick. What we really, really weed for is the environment it creates in humans who systematically come to view animals as interchangeable parts. And we furthermore think that that has a very negative environment on their research, how they approach it, what reports they give to companies, but furthermore, even how they interact with other human beings. Because we think how people interact with animals goes a long way into determining how they'll later end up interacting with humans. I want to do this in two parts. I first want to look at this in terms of animals, because we think the type of person who runs through 1,000 puppies in a year in terms of testing has a very, very different view, both of animals, we'd argue, than the generic person who sees a missing puppy poster on the street, but also probably of living things generally, in the sense that when you have a large number of them that you can use, you tend to see them as interchangeable parts. That means a couple things. It means that you don't really see pain as something they feel. In fact, pain is what you feel when they irritate you and force you to stay late by not dying on time or dying better. And we think that's a very very heartless approach. But we furthermore think that it tends to mean that, it tends to mean that when you have a surplus of animals you can test on, you don't necessarily try and go above and beyond. So they'd argue like we have diseases, but we don't think that what people generally do when they have infinite amounts of animal testing is try and cure them. Why? Because you don't really make money if curing or failing. You make money based on whether or not you confirm what your company already thinks drugs are going to do. So if you have an HIV drug, you get money by infecting the dog with HIV and testing the drug. You don't get money if that doesn't work and trying a slightly different drug unless people tell you to. And what we think that ends up doing is leading to an inferior quality of testing within. Now, we think if you have a human being who's already HIV infected, you kind of have an obligation to try and get them to live as long as possible. And definitely not to do things that might be counteracted to that, both because you'll probably end up with a better product and make money there, but also partly because you get sued if you try and treat them in the same way you treat a human. Yeah. And while we're perfectly willing to admit that we think there's downsides to human testing, we think, first of all, they consent to do it. And secondly, people would never treat them in the manner they treat animals. And thirdly, if you attempted to do so, they have legal recourse, which we think acts as a check and a potentially very positive motivator to research in this regard. Sure.
One of the reasons the animals suffer in this way is because the scientists are willing to take risks because they're animals. They're willing to push the boundaries and get those new drugs. If humans were sitting on the seat, there'd never be any progress because people will be scared.
Humans have put into experimental drugs numerous times willing to do it. We think that it's a different type of risk and a different approach to risk, and people are much more likely to abandon research and take it less seriously. We think when you lower the stakes, you fundamentally change what's there. We're willing to accept that if you randomly throw darts against the wall and allow people to do that, you'll probably find some things occasionally. We think that's true of any sort of field of research. But we think that you may also get distracted from actual focus of searches and other things while doing it. So we don't think that's an underlying benefit, and we think that's attitudinally wrong. We think it leads to a worse attitude in society. Why? Because we think animals are conditioning people. We think people like animals. We think that it's one thing when we've seen research that shows the people who had like dogs or cats growing up tend to make better parents, be less likely to engage in child abuse, less likely to engage in hitting their kids or other people, and generally tend to be calmer and less violent. Why? Because we think that having like a fluffy thing that you can hug has an empathetic effect on sort of how you approach life and how you approach other people and pain and things like that. We think what they're proposing here completely not only desensitizes this entire class of people who, when the puppy ends up dying on them during their thing, might go home and hit their kid, but we think it also desensitizes other people when we can simply use them and when we treat animals this way in this sort of industrialized system. Because when we think we can treat other living things that way, we can easily take a similar utilitarian approach to people, which is exactly the approach they're taking, which is if you really want to do this with people, we'd have to pay them so much money, and they might be tempted to do it, or God forbid we could do the alternative and hire poor people to do it. No, I mean, at that point, you're already seeing the natural progression of the pragmatic attitude involved on this side of the house.
That's exactly.
Well, you're a lawyer, so you appreciate that.
That's exactly what Ginny just said. Then. If this regulation comes in, the poor will have to be the testers, because ultimately they're the ones most desperate for the money. This is essentially just a socio-economic mechanism that hits the poor if you're side.
Yes, but wouldn't that increase the incentives to have testing actually cure people and benefit the testees? Whereas for animals, we don't really care if it benefits them or not because they're interchangeable. I mean, it's not really like anyone on your side has ever actually attempted to cure an animal or has ever actually cured them except by mistake. And in fact, I tend to believe, my understanding is that you tend to kill the animals you cure anyway. So you end back up in the starting place anyway. We think that it's highly unlikely you're going to kill your human test subjects. Though, if you're that heartless there, perfectly feel free to run that. It makes the round a bit easier for us. But it's for these reasons that we think that it ends up making people, because we think animals make people better, and that when you dehumanize, when you delegitimize animals and legitimize their mistreatment, you end up, by extension, delegitimizing treatment of proper treatment of humans. We think that is harmful. So we think this round is about, it's not just about the animals feel pain, but it's also what impact this has on humans who believe this is an appropriate course to take.
We thank Dan for his speech, and I'll let invite John Kay to start the case for closing opposition. John Kay was our previous training officer, was also our world's double often finalist. Yeah.
Okay, Dan's speech was a bit weird and scary, so I'm going to talk about two things in extension. I'm going to break down the different moral arguments in this debate. So first I'm going to do a bit more on the utilitarian approach, then I'm going to examine the kind of absolutist approach that could be the alternative, and show why none of them can be applied to both humans and animals together. But first, a bit of rebuttal. So firstly, I want to take down this idea that animal research is not always accurate. Firstly, we'd say that it's, like Ginny said, is about building up a load of knowledge, but also we point out that most animal testing doesn't happen in this kind of scattergun random approach. There are lots of meta-testing on the appropriate types of animals to test certain drugs. This is how we build up, and there has been a long-standing body of research on how to do this testing effectively, which we immediately throw away and dismiss, and would take years and years to build up, meanwhile people are dying, if we were to ban all animal testing. Secondly, the stuff about like cost-effectiveness and stuff like that, and it's just drug companies trying to be as cost-effective as possible. We say that like, when it comes down to it, actually cost-effectiveness does save lives, because when a drug company can produce more drugs, can produce drugs at a cheaper cost, which means the NHS are more or less able to buy these drugs and more able to provide them to people and save lives. Like, money may sound depressing and evil, but it is very important in this debate because it saves real lives when it comes down to it. Secondly, this kind of Daniel accusation that we don't have a line and we're being too nice sometimes and too utilitarian the other times. Like, we say that we actually do have a very principled line on our side of the house, something that they can't provide. We will do this in the most utilitarian manner possible. This means that when it comes to regulating animals so they don't have excessive harm and excessive pain, we will do this as long as this isn't outweighed by the benefits it provides to future generations in terms of drug use. That's a very clear and principled line that we're able to provide. Next stands kind of scary and crazy extension about the moment we test animals, we start killing everyone else in the streets. Like, we don't think this is the case. Firstly, because it doesn't happen at the moment. Secondly, his idea of like commodifying animals and seeing them as like just parts in a machine. Well, we say like you can ban animal testing, but still everyone's eating meat. Like, that's not going to be this perfect world that you stand by. Like, and we don't think that it's very easy to change the eating habits of people in the same way it's easy to pass legislation banning animal testing. This kind of commodification still takes place. Secondly, it's not mutually exclusive to give people nice puppies to stroke, but still experiment on mice and rats to cure cancer. Like, they're not mutually exclusive worlds. If we need to give the psychopaths kittens to stroke, we're quite willing to do that on our side of the house. So, like, now onto the kind of two broad moral arguments. So we say there's like, the argument that's kind of come out initially on first half is animals have moral claims. They have a claim to utility because they suffer. We can completely agree with this claim. But this doesn't actually prove any of their point in the debate, because we say that there are different pains that need to be balanced out, and we think that sometimes curing cancer will remove less pain than the animals. But then there's like the higher burden that we've taken on prop side, proving that it's better to cause these pain on animals than humans. So Sammy gave some arguments. I'll give like 3 more now. So firstly, like just on an intuitive level, we think that our laws should reflect our intuitions in some way in order for people to buy in. If given a choice between saving a kitten or a baby, it's a difficult choice, we'd probably still save the baby. That just intuitively seems to us more the case. Next, a kind of physiological case. We say that like we're perfectly able to understand that certain organisms can experience more pain than other organisms. Like we say that like something with a smaller nervous system than a human, like probably does feel less actual pain purely in the moment. But thirdly, onto the more philosophical case, and the idea that we have experiences through time and a conception of what it means to be a being through time. So when we kill an animal, like we haven't frustrated its plans to go to the pub with its friends next week in the same way that we might do if we harm a human. And like on Dan's kind of thing about we'll hire loads of people instead or whatever, but they won't do it and we'll be forced to improve standards. We say certain tests are necessarily risky in order to get better results, and people will never sign up to them because there is a high percentage of death, so simply will not happen. So like, I think I've done enough, and we as an op bench have done enough to prove to you that this kind of welfarist, kind of utilitarian approach falls on our side of the house. So what would prop need to suggest otherwise? They need to suggest a more absolute standard. They need to suggest some kind of rights-based approach, which means that animals have to necessarily be protected from this kind of experimentation. Why won't this work? Firstly, such a system is kind of implausible, because we necessarily are going to violate rights in any kind of trade-off. So when we have the choice between violating 3 rights or 1 right, we still end up in a trade-off situation where we'd rather violate the 1 right than the 3 rights. There's like a paradox there on any kind of deontological framework that they might suggest. No, thank you. So we say that, like, actually, how might a right-based approach be constructed? So I'll do a bit of the work for them here, like, just to tear it down. So we say, like, one way might be to construct it socially. So we say that we give people rights under a framework of utility because it makes us feel secure, you know? Once we know there are certain absolutes that are never going to be crossed, we feel secure, and it makes us live happier lives overall. The problem is, mice don't respond to this because they don't have this kind of conception of security in the first place. So when they see mice A be violated, they don't go, "Oh, I'm worried, mice A just got violated." They just keep on living in the moment, eating food and reproducing because they're animals and don't have that kind of conception of themselves. Do you mean?
Well, isn't this the whole point of the case we advanced on the side of the bench? The idea that you're like trying to construct, you know, like social justifications for like the natural entities of animals being in a state of suffering. The reason why they can't conceive of these things because they're fundamentally different and actually respected.
Okay, Jamil, like, that's all very nice if you have some kind of fairy tale moral utopia that you can create. What we're saying is morality itself is something that is eventually constructed. So the rights that you need to construct to win the case are themselves constructed, and they're constructed in such a way that animals simply can't respond to them because they don't get the benefits. Let's look at other kind of rights-based frameworks which might help their side. One, like classic rights-based framework, no, you're out of time, Dan, like might be the idea of reciprocity. It's the idea that I don't harm you, you don't harm me, we give each other rights because this allows society to function. Unfortunately, tell that to Mr. Tiger, he doesn't go along with that because tigers and animals don't tend to have the kind of level of rationality to buy into any kind of social construct or social contract. They're not going to grant you those rights, and you don't in turn have obligations to grant them back. Like, finally, the final kind of potential way you might be able to come up with some rights-based framework would be through pure reason, Kantian rationality, or a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. The problem again is, try and get a mouse to select principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance. They don't tend to come up with that many theories, because they're not rational beings. And the fact that they're not rational beings distances themselves from the moral frameworks that we might apply. Like, the very final thing they might come up with to oppose this is like chimpanzees, and fine, we might bite the bullet and say, that's a bad thing, we'll just experiment on mice. But overall, you should not ban all animal testing.
Thank John, who I mislabeled and is actually World Top 2 finalist. That was my mistake. I'm sorry. And we'll now like to invite Carla to close the case for... He was also my training officer, so this is doubly bad. We'll now like to invite Carla to close the case for site government. Carla represented LSE at Worlds and is also a Euro semi-finalist.
The reason why John's case misses the point of the proposition entirely is that we never established the fact that we shouldn't test on animals on the basis that these animals have rights. We rested that claim on the fact that we think that when you test on animals, they suffer, basically they suffer to an extent that we find unacceptable, right? In order for you to understand that, we think that in the context of this debate, you have to ask yourself 3 questions, right? First, is it justified to value people over animals? Second, what are the consequences of stopping invasive animal testing? Because it's important to clarify this as invasive animal testing, because we were willing to research on animals when it wasn't invasive, right? And thirdly, what are the broader consequences of invasive animal testing, right? But so let's talk about the first question. Is it justified to value people over animals? They tell us several things here in side proposition. The first thing they tell us is that people enjoy longer lives and higher quality lives, therefore we ought to value the lives of people, right? I have several responses to this. First, why is length a legitimate basis for judging the quality of life, right? We think it isn't, right? Because it's legitimate to choose a shorter but more fulfilling life than a longer but empty one, ladies and gentlemen, right? That's why we allow people to do things that plausibly shorten their lives if it means that they feel like their lives are fuller as a consequence. That's why we allow people to consume cigarettes. That's why we allow people to consume alcohol, right? We respect their choices. The next response is that what makes them say that the quality of people's lives are necessarily higher, right? We don't experience the world in the same way that animals do, so we don't think it's fair for them to claim that necessarily just because Sammy thinks he'd rather be Sammy than a dog, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of life of a dog is necessarily better. For one thing, dogs have fewer problems, right, so maybe, possibly, right, might be a better life, right? Thirdly, we think that a shorter, lower quality life isn't a legitimate basis to value that life less, right? People in poorer countries live shorter, lower quality lives, Mr. Speaker, right? Or, well, Madam Speaker, actually, sorry. If what Sammy is saying is true, then a necessary consequence of that moral claim is that it would be legitimate to experiment on people from developing countries. That is a consequence that we cannot accept inside proposition, and we think that is not a legitimate basis for claiming that we can experiment on animals, right? The next thing they said was that people are stronger and more evolutionary equipped, right? This is something that people used to say about blacks, right? That's why they were slaves, because white people were superior, stronger, or whatever, right? That's not a good reason to do this. We say, moreover, children and mentally handicapped people are weaker and less equipped in many ways relative to the rest of society. That it doesn't make it okay to experiment upon them, right? The next thing we would point out, and I alluded to this already earlier, is we don't experience the world in the same way that animals do. So we cannot ever quantify the amount of suffering that we impose upon them when we experiment upon them. And we think that the amount of suffering really is great, right? Even if we could attempt to quantify it. We think we should err on the side of caution when it comes to this. The final thing I'd like to respond to with regard to what John says, when he says that animals can't conceive of themselves as beings through time. Therefore, it must be justified to experiment upon them, right? This is crazy, right? The reason why this doesn't make sense is because actually not being able to conceive yourself as a being through time makes your suffering so much worse. The reason why it makes your suffering so much worse is because if you cannot conceive of yourself, if all you experience is the now, and you cannot conceive of yourself in the future or in the past, where you may plausibly not have been suffering, your entire world is about suffering, right? That's actually an argument that says that the suffering of animals is worse, and we should prioritize their suffering over ours, right? That's nonsense. The second thing I'd like to, what is that? There. The second question in this debate is, what are the consequences of stopping invasive animal testing, right? All along, opposition eventually said bad things, right? And we're willing to admit that we might lose some medical progress as a consequence of no longer testing on animals, right? But 2 important claims that you have to recognize that we've made in our proposition bench. Firstly, what we lose isn't as bad as what opposition makes it out to be. And we say, secondly, what we give up by stopping animal testing
is worth giving up in light of the moral and ethical costs of animal testing, ladies and gentlemen, right? Because what are the alternatives to invasive animal testing, right? There are many of them. First of all, we gave you the idea of human testing with informed consent, right? So even if it's harmful, they could consent to that harm. Their response in first proposition was, what about poor people who might be forced to do this, right? Just because you're forced by socio-economic circumstances to make a certain choice doesn't make that choice illegitimate, right? We're all forced to find jobs after we graduate from college or whenever it is we graduate, in my case, right? So we're all forced to do that, but that doesn't make it an illegitimate choice, right? Moreover, this information is likely to be better, right? Because experimentation is about knowing its impact on people. Obviously, we're better placed to know its impact on people when you actually test it on people who volunteer, right? Moreover, we can use computer simulations, right? Computational biology. Advancements in computational power has been so great that we can model complex biological process at the level of molecules, cells, tissues, and what have you, right? So we think that we can produce results without causing suffering. Moreover, we can also use observational data instead of experimental data, right? We think that advances in statistical and incremental methodologies, and I know this being a PhD student, allows us to establish causal mechanisms without necessarily experimenting people, right? These are things that allow us to progress in medical research without harming animals without their consent, right? We're willing to admit that there might be less progress as a consequence of engaging in these avenues instead, but we think that's a price we'll pay to prevent all the harms we've talked about here in proposition. The last question is short but important one, right? What are the broader consequences of experimenting animals, right? We think firstly, it perpetuates actions on the basis of questionable moral grounds, right? I've explained this quite clearly already, right? We've seen lots of questionable moral claims on proposition. But secondly, we think, and Dan brings you this, is that it creates a climate that deprioritizes empathy. And we think that empathy is of massive importance, because we think that empathy is what makes the world a better place, and we think the lack of empathy is what necessarily legitimizes the worst atrocities that the world has ever seen. We are proud to stand in proposition.
Thank you, Colin, for your speech. I would now like to invite the last speaker of the day, Ariella, to deliver her case for closing opposition. Ariella has represented LSE at both University Animals and is also a Royal Holloway finalist.
Okay, thanks a lot, Madam Speaker, and everyone who showed up. Hopefully you were entertained. Okay, so I think what's kind of interesting is that we never actually hear any legitimate sort of moral framework at all on side government. Side-op is the only one that gives you any sort of criteria for how we ought to make our decisions writ large, not on sort of just a case-by-case basis, right? So let's first hear some responses to what they've just given us. And I'm going to sum up sort of why generally we've won the debate for you today, right? So we actually don't hear any response from Carlo as to why, as to sort of John's critique of Dan's case, which is how you don't actually automatically gain lots of respect for animals all over the place if you ban animal testing. Take the world we live in today, right? I just ate a hamburger, but animal testing still happens. That's the other world. But anyway, you understand what I mean. So banning animal testing doesn't necessarily lead to a greater world, and we're going to tell you why, right? So what we hear is that we don't provide a rights-based defense. So actually we did that, and we did it in two different ways. And what we give you is not only a rights-based approach, but also the animal welfareism case, and why we actually can make a legitimate case for sometimes sacrificing some rights, but gaining others. So what we hear from them is, why is length a legitimate criteria for making decisions, right? Like, why is the length of an organism's life a legitimate criteria for making a decision on whether or not we're going to test on it? So first we're going to say that's only one criteria on which we make those decisions, right? We give you a host of other different ways in which animals differ from humans. There are actually animals that live longer than humans, so that's definitely not one of the only criteria that we're making this decision on. We're also saying that this is not just an absolute criteria, it's a criteria based on degree. There's a very big difference between living sort of, 10 years versus 30 and living 10 years versus 90, right? Then we hear this critique of our case is a slippery slope, that automatically we're going to start testing on people, and that our case legitimizes testing based on sort of monetary incentives. So we're going to be making medical experiments on the third world, and that's really bad. So first off, not really, but second of all, this is a debate about animals, so that doesn't really apply, right? People can make choices in the status quo. People can make choices to opt into forms of medical research, and they do all the time, and they do that for lots of different reasons, and that's why this debate isn't sort of the same debate here. So the slippery slope argument isn't exactly sort of the same type of analysis that we're talking about today. We also hear that there are different realities, that the absolute suffering of animals is worse than the controlled suffering of humans that can happen, right? But cross-apply all the stuff that John gave you about how there are harms that a person can experience and animals can never experience. So even if the harm is different in degree, it's also different in kind, right? So the types of harms that humans can experience, I'll take you later on, are types of harms that animals by definition are not able to experience, right? Then we hear this stuff that's kind of near from Carlo about how we can do other stuff that replaces animals, and that's really great, right? Like we can generate simulations on computers. So first off, it's not as good, and if it were as good, we probably wouldn't be testing on animals today, right? But also, we see that we fundamentally lose some types of critical testing that's very important, because as good as a computer is going to be, it's never ever going to be the actual thing. And it's never going to have the different types of variations that happen in real-world scenarios, which is why animals that can very closely form sort of model organisms and closely mirror types of biological processes that happen in human bodies, because certain types of animals have organs that behave in very similar ways when exposed to different pathogens as human bodies. That's the reason why computers and other alternatives will simply never suffice. But what we never hear any sort of real response to is our analysis of the burden. And you get this right from first half, right? So what's the burden that they have to, or that we have to meet? So what we need to demonstrate is that there's a legitimate justification some of the time to do some testing on animals, right? We're not saying that like all animals should die to decide whether or not my shampoo is going to make me itch or not. So that's not the case that we have to defend, right? We have to say that sometimes it's justifiable to test on some animals. We give you a bunch of practical benefits, right? There's medical benefits. They say that it's not useful, we tell you why it is. We also give you some analysis as to why with animals you get a greater sample size, which in scientific experimentation is incredibly important. I'll take you in 1 second. We also tell you that the cost to humans is a lot greater than the cost to animals, right? It's not exactly a one-to-one correlation that you get, which they conflate on their side of the house. Our capacity to feel pain and our capacity to understand the pain that we're feeling is infinitely greater than that of animals, right? Also, the externalities that humans experience when exposed to different types of experimentation is far greater, because we can not only conceptualize the future, we can also plan for it. Yeah.
How does the material you just stated about the necessity of animal testing relate to the material that came out from Opening Gum, where we clearly stated the problem is incentive structures towards cost efficiency and pleasing GlaxoSmithKline shareholders means that it seems the only option. That is not necessarily the case. Further investment in new technologies disincentivize our current system. It's not impossible.
Right, but the thing is, the two things can happen at the same time, right? The pharmaceutical industry has a lot of money, so those two things aren't mutually exclusive. They can't test on animals or invest in new technologies. They can do both things at the same time. GSK has a lot of money, so they can do both of those things. Also, all the analysis that you give us about the impacts of commercialization doesn't actually stem from animal testing. This would happen anyway and does in the status quo. Animal testing is just something that happens in that context. So what we give you on second half is really the fundamental animal welfareism case that tells you why all the stuff that they give you just doesn't suffice, right? So other moral claims exist that compete with all the stuff that they tell you. Just because animals suffer doesn't mean that the benefits that we get aren't legitimate. Even if they get penicillin on their side of the house from other forms of experimentation, we still can prove to you that we get it faster. And the benefits we get from getting that penicillin faster far outweigh any of the harms that have accrued from the experimentation that occurred in trying to get it, right? You hear from John about all the differences between humans and animals and why they haven't actually proven to us why it's okay for humans to suffer. Why it's okay for humans to suffer at the expense of animals. We give you a fundamental rights-based account of how the trade-off of rights is justified in this case, how we save more human lives on our side of the house, we're proud to oppose.
Thank all the speakers for their speeches. Now, I know as LSE students, we don't normally deal with physical things like animals and science and medicine, and we normally like to make things up like law and economics. But after all those speeches, we'd like to now invite you guys to take a vote as to whether you think animal research should be banned in all forms, or whether it shouldn't be banned in all forms. So, all of those in favor of banning all forms of animal research, can you please raise your hands? 1, 2. Brilliant. And all of those that aren't in favor of banning all forms of animal research. I'm going to have to count this slowly, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and Ross abstains. So, through a vote of 20 to 1, this House would not ban all forms